Today on Public Research.
I do think that Beijing sees Iran as being very strategically weakened right now. Not just Iran itself, but things aren't going well for their proxies. Iran's lost a lot of influence in the region, and so from Beijing's perspective, things are looking, shaky for Iran, and so that you have this incentive to want to help shore up their capabilities. And so that's why I wouldn't be terribly surprised if you do see China providing some direct military support for Iran.
After being dominated from the air by Israel and the U.S. during the 12-day war of June 2025, a wounded Iranian regime is seeking China's J-10 fighter jet and advanced air defense systems, a transfer of technology and weaponry from China that could be a game changer in the Israel-Iran conflict. Today, the Deputy Director of CSIS's China Power project, Brian Hart, joins me to discuss China's J-10 fighter jet, the possibility of China selling it to Iran, and the larger rise of what some are calling an axis of upheaval, consisting of Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China itself. After decades of warning, Israel has struck Iran's nuclear program, demonstrating air dominance over Iran. But after the 12-day war, there's a wild card that could change the equation entirely. It's not Iran or Israel, it's China. To help unpack this dimension, I'm joined by Brian Hart, Deputy Director of the CSIS China Power project. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I want to back up to a sort of mini war that took place, I think maybe last month, between Pakistan and India. Now, can you explain the China element of that as far as the jets that were involved?
Yeah, so this has gotten a lot of attention in recent weeks because of the significant extent to which Pakistan relies on China for its military equipment. So, if you look at the data, something like 75 to 80% of Pakistan's arms imports are from China. So it's heavily dependent on Chinese equipment, and it's the top destination for Chinese arms exports. So they're close partners, and so anytime I think Pakistan's engaged in a conflict or in a crisis like this, people look to see what the China angle is here, just because it's such an important background player. And essentially what happened is that, and I would flag that a lot of this is disputed. A lot of this information, we're coming from the open source. There's not perfect reporting on this, but the broad strokes are that Pakistan was using Chinese-made J-10 aircraft, which are pretty much the most advanced aircraft in Pakistan's Air Force. These are 4.5 generation aircraft, which, they're pretty advanced, maybe not as advanced as, or certainly not as advanced as the most advanced fighters like the F-35 in the United States or things like that, which are fifth generation aircraft, but it's quite a capable aircraft. So Pakistan was using these in their air-to-air fight with the Indian Air Force. And the reports are that, and again, they're mixed, but essentially it looks like these J-10 aircraft were involved in shooting down probably two Indian aircraft, an Indian Rafale and one other aircraft. And so the Indian Rafale is, this Western-made aircraft. So this kind of, the analysts have gone to look at this as, this J-10 Chinese-made aircraft shot down a Western-made similar capable aircraft, and so this was seen as really good news for China, and that this shows that Chinese equipment is really advanced. I'm a lot more skeptical than that. I actually don't think that the J-10 had that much to do with what we believe happened. I think this is less of a story of the J-10 itself, because this wasn't the kind of dogfight that you imagine from Top Gun, where you have close-in aircraft shooting at each other within visible range. This was, from what we know, this was really a story of aircraft shooting at each other from well beyond visual range. These are far, dozens of miles away. So this is more of a question of packages of sensors, of electromagnetic warfare, of overall systems integration of these things. And so, and I think that you have to put that in the context of the overall capabilities at play within these two militaries, not just look at these aircraft themselves. But that hasn't stopped people from saying that this is all a story of China being the big winner here in terms of their capabilities. The stocks for the aircraft maker in China went up once this news broke, and there's been reports now that China will now maybe have a better chance of exporting the J-10 because of this. So there's a lot of speculation about this, but I think my overall take is that it's this particular conflict didn't tell us that much specifically about the J-10 itself.
And the Rafale is a French-made aircraft.
Right. Yes.
And it's been a blow to that company's reputation so much that the CEO came out, and there's all this controversy over did the Rafale get shot down. So China, as you know, usually tries to keep an even keel, just sort of focus on economics. They have relationships with Israel. They have relationships with Iran. But after the 12-day war, is it correct the foreign minister of Iran went to Beijing and was videotaped in a jet? I know you're an expert. You can't probably tell me yes, they will or they won't, but is China going to sell a J-10 to Iran, do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, so far, I think there's been, so far what we've seen visually, what we can see in the open source is that China's been providing rhetorical support for Iran, denouncing the strikes, the Israeli and U.S. strikes on Iran, coming politically to Iran's defense. Iran's defense minister was in China shortly after the conflict as part of a scheduled meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a security organization that China and Russia really, especially China, really dominate, and that Iran recently joined. So that was an interesting instance of Iran kind of being a part of this bloc and visiting China. So an interesting, I think, sign of political support here from China. I think on the question of whether China will start to, return to arming Iran, I think is a big question, a very big open question. And there's been a lot of, so far, a lot of chatter and I think conflicting reporting on this. Earlier this week, there was reporting from a couple of non-mainstream media sources that China was already starting to sell, had already started to deliver HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries, air defense batteries, to Iran, which are some of China's most advanced air defense systems, and then that was quickly disputed, and I think that so far Chinese officials have kind of said that that's not happening. But then and then there's also a lot of chatter that Iran needs to build up its air force. So in addition to these air defense systems, they also need more aircraft, and that they may now look to China for these J-10s because they were supposedly successful in Pakistan. I'm skeptical of the lessons we should draw about the J-10 from the Pakistan incident. So, if I was Iran, I wouldn't read too much into that incident in terms of, they're capable aircraft, but I don't think that that incident should, really be the deciding factor in whether Iran chooses to go with those. I think the question is more about what Iran itself needs, and what it can get from any partner. I think Iran's military is in quite, a tough situation right now, with the, degrading of their air defenses, their air force, by Israel and U.S. forces as well. So it's more about what Iran needs, and I think that they're going to seek what they can get from Russia or China. They've had some more success with going with Russian systems in the past, like the S-300 for their air defenses. But I think China's going to be, in terms of what we see going forward, I wouldn't be surprised if China does decide to sell some equipment to Iran. I could see a situation in which they do sell the J-10 aircraft, or where they do sell some of these air defenses. I think that would be a big significant shift. I think it would be an escalation on their part to get more directly involved in supporting Iran. But I don't see it as beyond the possibility. But so far, I think the reporting on this has been very mixed. An interesting, anecdote here is that after the reports that they've been sending mixed signals. So actually, reporters asked Chinese officials in the Ministry of Defense, are you going to sell Iran these aircraft? And the Iranian or the Chinese official response was a very, kind of almost a tongue-in-cheek statement of, we'll sell to friends if we want to, but they didn't confirm or deny whether they would do that. On the other side of that, we saw when the reports came out that China was supposedly selling the HQ-9 air defenses to Iran this week, we then saw some statement, I think, by the Chinese ambassador to Israel saying a really weird response, which is that China, doesn't export. We take seriously the issue of proliferation, and we don't export weapons of mass destruction. Um, the HQ-9 is not a weapon of mass destruction, so that was a really weird response. That was also the same response that the Israeli or the Chinese ambassador gave in an interview a couple of months ago when asked about this. He said, "We're not selling to Iran. We don't sell WMDs." Again, no one was asking about them selling China selling WMDs to Iran. They were asked about conventional equipment. So it was a bit of a weird response to. So I'm not exactly sure what to read from that, but it's a weird response from them. So I think the long story short is it's too soon to tell, but I wouldn't be entirely surprised if China does, get involved in certain ways.
There are clips from Chinese journalists discussing the possibility of Pakistan leasing their J-10s or some kind of deal where basically it would be like covering for China, where it's like, well, that's sort of Pakistan's deal. Is that a possibility?
I mean, a couple of
Yeah.
things there. I think, you know, that's a big question of Pakistan, and I'm not an expert on
Yeah.
Pakistan, so
Right.
I don't know what Pakistan's going to do. My initial thought about them is that, I mean, they only have, I think, around 30 of these J-10 aircraft in their Air Force, and I think that there's a total order for something like 3 dozen. So there's more to supposedly come from China to Pakistan. So it's not like they have a huge inventory of these to give to Iran. Um, and if they were to give those away, they would need to get permission from China to transfer those Chinese-made aircraft to Iran. So if Pakistan does that, that would imply that they've done so with Beijing's consent. Um, I'm skeptical that that's the route they're going to do here, just again because I think Iran's needs are very significant. Iran has a lot of airspace to cover. I think recapitalizing their air force is going to require more than just a handful of J-10s. And so I think if this happens, I think it's more likely that it's going to come from China itself. But again, it's hard to say.
So I'm sort of obsessed with this, as I'm surprised by how little attention, especially a lot of Israeli media, seem to be giving to this. If I was the head of Mossad, this would be like, one of my top focus areas, making sure that this doesn't happen. Um, but Iran, it was sort of funny. I was watching a former Air Force expert. I think his name is Ward Connolly. His coverage of the air war, and he was an old Tomcat pilot, and he covered the conflict, and he only got emotional once when he was watching the footage of Israel destroying old Tomcats, and he was like,
Yeah.
we asked the Israelis to do a special operation to save them. So
It is understandable, but as a Tomcat lifelong guy, it truly breaks my heart to see those airplanes come to that end in that way.
But what it reveals is Iran was relying on these aircraft from the 70s. So how much of a game changer would that be, going from 70s aircrafts to J-10s?
I mean, it would be I think, a big leap for Iran, I think, in terms of capabilities. And I mean, the other thing I would say, is, even if Iran magically gets several J-10s from China quickly, it's going to take a while for them to integrate those into their Air Force, to train on those, to integrate. Again, these aircraft are more than just the aircraft themselves. You need a system, an integrated system to support them. You need sensors, you need what we call AWACS, airborne early warning and control. Those are actually a really integral part of, targeting and, making sure that when you actually fire on something, it hits its target. And I think that that's, again, going back to the Pakistan incident, that that system, that integrated system that Pakistan it seems to have employed, especially with a lot of Chinese-made equipment, that's the bigger story here to me than just the J-10, is that the Pakistan was able to employ this system of overall capabilities successfully to find the targets, fire on the targets, and hit them. That takes a lot of integrated systems, especially in kind of these complicated electromagnetic environments. And so, again, if Iran gets these J-10 aircraft overnight, it's going to take a while before I think that they could really integrate that system in a really capable way.
Let's say in an alternative universe 2 years ago, Iran had gotten sort of the Pakistan deal. I know it's impossible, but how would you play out how what was a 12-day war might have gone if they had those Chinese capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, obviously very purely speculative, but I think they maybe would have had a bit of a better, chance. But I think again, the key thing here is air defenses too. I mean, Iranian aircraft, Israel has, F-35s, which are essentially the most advanced fighter aircraft, produced today and in operation today. And those aircraft have a sizable advantage over like the J-10 4, maybe 4.5 generation aircraft. I mean, they have an advantage in stealth, they have an advantage in sensors, and just in a lot of different ways are more advanced. So if you go up, if you wanted to think about this, if Iran had J-10s, I still think that the Israeli have a much bigger lead in the air, in the air than Iran, even in that scenario.
But does it eliminate the possibility of what happened where Israel basically owned the air above Tehran for 2 weeks?
It's hard to say. Again, I actually think air defenses, ground-based air defenses, are maybe one of the biggest game changers here, because it looks like Iranian air defenses just didn't do the job fully. That they're relying on a combination of Russian S-300 systems and some of Iranian's own indigenously produced systems based on some other Russian Chinese technologies. It just looks like those air defenses weren't able to kind of hold up to things like the F-35, which are more stealthy. If a big question that I would put out is, if Iran had a really capable force of the Russian S-400 air defense systems, maybe that would have been a bigger game changer, because the S-400, I think, would have fared more capably in terms of covering the large scope of Iran's territory and airspace, but also I think that they're more capable, in terms of tracking these stealthier aircraft that Israel has. So I think that, just pure speculation, that might have had a bigger impact than than Iran having J-10 aircraft.
Russia's more complicated. One, they have their own war, right? And
Yeah.
and I think, as Putin said, there are a lot of Russians in Israel. So arming Iran, potentially, if Iran was to kill a lot of Israelis, they'd be killing a lot of Israelis with Russian heritage or even co-citizenship. And they've been delaying, right? So Iran bought a Russian jet a while ago. They still haven't got it. Has Israel, have they explicitly said to China, don't sell Iran J-10s?
It's a good question. I haven't tracked whether they've specifically said that in recent weeks. I know, the United States has recently sanctioned Chinese companies for selling dual-use goods, or essentially, earlier this year, I think in April, the U.S. sanctioned Chinese companies for selling Iran. I think at the time it was sodium perchlorate, which is a chemical used for ballistic missile fuel. And there's also recently been reporting that China is about to ship an additional shipment of ammonium perchlorate, which is a similar kind precursor for these fuels for ballistic missiles. So obviously the United States doesn't want to see China arming Iran, especially on those things like ballistic missiles. So, but I would say one of the key things here is In terms of what China could provide or what Russia could provide, I think the United States and other countries will see those, will view them differently based on what the capability is. Because it's one thing to sell defensive capabilities and another to sell offensive capabilities. So, selling ballistic missiles or equipment to support ballistic missile production, that's a significant concern from the US perspective, and obviously Israel's, because those are the key way by which Iran has been holding at risk, US bases in the region, and obviously Israeli targets. And Iran has capability to produce a lot of those missiles. So that's always been a big concern. But something like an air defense system or an aircraft for, air defense is maybe less concerning from a US perspective, than those missiles. But I do think that Washington should be concerned by any significant security strengthening between Beijing and Tehran.
Let's say Trump this afternoon just said, China, don't sell J-10s to Iran. Would that basically scare China off from doing that?
I don't think so. Not specifically. I think they would want to. Beijing's going to be cautious about how they engage the region, on their own reasons, not just because of the United States. I do think that, if President Trump threatened really serious sanctions on China for doing that, that might change their behavior. But I think Beijing, their goal right now is to see Tehran in a more stable position. I don't think they want to see the regime fall. They don't want to see, but they also don't want to see an escalation of the conflict. So, and in fact, you see China's defense minister, Dong Jun, talking about recently, China essentially wanting to provide Iran with a strategic buffer. They want Iran to be secure and not unstable in the situation. They want to go back to kind of the status quo. They want Iran to be a thorn in the U.S. side, but they don't want it to be so destabilizing that it becomes a broader destabilizing, impact on the region.
They were giving Iran, like, I'm going to get the terminology wrong, but these mixers, right, that are used to make, I think, ballistic missiles, right? That's confirmed, right?
That, I'm not sure about that, so don't want to speak to exactly that. But China's big value add for Russia, for example, has been on these dual use goods, and I think that that's an important part of what they'll do for Iran, because providing these dual use goods is exactly where China's strengths are. They have this big capability in industrial production, chemicals, metals, things like that. And they can provide that. They've provided that to Russia to great effect, things like semiconductors, things that are useful for the war in Ukraine. They can do the same for Iran without necessarily, going up to that edge of providing, weapons. So as a baseline, I do expect China to supply, dual use goods to Iran to the extent that they can get away with it.
Now, can you tell me about the relationship? Is this confirmed about some of the help that's been alleged that China has given the Houthis, I think, about targeting information? Or is that speculative? What do we actually know about that?
Yeah, so from what I've seen reporting that I think Chinese companies provided commercial satellite imagery to the Houthis to help with their situational awareness and potentially targeting. But beyond that, I don't know the details of it. But that's actually I do think that's a good anecdote of some of the things that we could see China do going forward. Because it's not just what China provides to Iran directly, it's also what can China provide to, their axis of resistance throughout the Middle East, these proxies that are, causing trouble throughout the region. So China can support those as well, because those are one of the main ways in which Iran influences the region. It's not just, as we were saying, Iran's own military is pretty conventionally limited in terms of, like, it's not as advanced as Israel's on some of these high-end systems. So the way that they've really caused havoc in the region is through their missile capabilities and through their proxies in the region. And so if China can help support both of those quietly, then that's a key way that China could support Iran.
So here's the mystery to me. Iran's a poor country. After decades of sanctions, China seems to have all of the leverage. They're the only big country that's still illegally or buying Iranian oil. Iran, as Trump would say, doesn't seem to be holding a lot of cards in that relationship, right? So it seems like there is something different from the usual thing of China's just trying to stay out of the headlines, just pursue its If that was really just their focus, why would they even wouldn't they just say to the Iranian guy, don't come here after the war. Don't get into one of our J-10 jets, and we don't want, or let's not send them these mixers that can be used for that. We don't want any part of this. It's only going to be trouble for China. Is the fact that they've been willing to do some of this stuff, does it suggest that actually there's something else going on here?
Yeah. So at the surface, you might wonder why Beijing would want to support Iran. And I do think that a lot of the dynamics that you laid out are true. So I think there's a lot of skepticism in China about Iran. There's this view that they should be a lot stronger than they are. They should be wealthier than they are. They should be, they shouldn't be as developed, they shouldn't be as, they should be more strategic. I think Beijing often and a lot of if you look at what Chinese commentators and netizens are saying online, there's often this view that Iran is not always strategic. It's driven more by ideology and theology than it is by, good strategy. And so a lot of what Iran does, I think, does kind of frustrate Beijing sometime. But at the end of the day, I think China feels like it gets benefit from supporting Iran to a certain extent. So number one, you named oil. Something like 90% of Iran's sanctioned oil goes to China through indirect means. They typically get transshipped at places like Malaysia and then make their way to China. So if you look at Chinese customs data, it's showing up as Malaysian oil, but it's largely Iranian oil. But so China's getting about 13 to 15% of their crude oil for Iran. So quite a bit. That's a big economic and energy security benefit from Iran. But I think the other big thing is, and this is the Washington view here, that a lot of what people in Washington are paying attention to is this growing concern about an axis of upheaval. The China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis. I think I have qualms with the use of the term axis, but I do think that there's growing evidence of these countries working together in a loose sort of network to kind of opportunistically help each other. I think we've seen a really significant intensification of that since the war in Ukraine, and I think that this new war with Iran will be another marker that we can see whether this axis is actually, what extent is it actually a thing? And so I'm really watching to see what Beijing does here. I do think they have interests at play here. I do think they want to support the regime in Tehran, but they're just like they've done with Russia. They want to support them just to the level they can without creating too much direct blowback on themselves.
But let's take the footage of the Iranian minister in the Chinese aircraft. If China said, "Hey, you know what? We're not going to have that on camera. That wouldn't be a good look for us." What's Iran going to do? So why would they do that?
I mean, I think Iran does have a little bit of leverage
Really?
with Beijing, just a little bit in the sense that, number one, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's about regime stability and security. So again, Beijing doesn't want to see the regime fall, and so that they have an incentive to want to protect Iran to some extent, because the outcome of the regime falling could be even worse for China. And really, I think you need to put the perspective here of how two things. One is that the main thing that Iran and Iran and China have in common is their opposition to the United States and to the West. And so, from Beijing's perspective, Iran stirring up some trouble in the Middle East, distracting the United States from pivoting more to the Indo-Pacific, all of those things, Iran being a constant thorn in the side of the U.S. is good news for China strategically. So there is some leverage there.
Yeah, I kind of suspect that the fact that Israel and the U.S. were just basically, they own the skies of Iran. They did this big bombing without even getting touched. Iran's only response, apparently they called the Americans, said, we're just going to fire a few missiles at Qatar, don't do anything. They look so exposed as a paper tiger. Do you think China looks at that and doesn't I sort of wonder if they think, the next time this happens, we don't want it to be such a blowout, because that sort of makes our side look bad.
Yeah, so I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Is I do think that Beijing sees Iran as being very strategically weakened right now. Not just Iran itself, but things aren't going well for their proxies. I mean, Israel has degraded Hamas, and Hezbollah, and also the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Iran's lost a lot of influence in the region. And so from Beijing's perspective, things are looking, shaky for Iran. And so that you have this incentive to want to help shore up their capabilities. And so that's why I wouldn't be terribly surprised if you do see China providing, some direct military support for Iran in the form of sales. Plus, I mean, that's good business for the Chinese defense industry. China really doesn't do arms sales nearly to the extent of the United States, or Russia, but they could move forward as their defense industry develops. There could be greater interest in selling those abroad, and Tehran might be a receptive market.
I think that the Iran-Israel conflict is not over. There's going to be a part 2 to this. I think there's way too much focus on the what will determine when Israel goes back to Iran is Iran making the nuclear bomb. I think they destroyed a lot of the facilities that are needed for some of the last steps to do that. But I do think that this China wild card could be what triggers Israel feeling like they need to act again in Iran. If you're Netanyahu, if you're head of Mossad, and let's say in 3 months they get intelligence that Iran is about to do a major shipment of not just J-10s, but of air defense and stuff like that, just sort of wargaming this. Do you think that would basically force Israel to feel like, well, in some way we have to act to stop this?
That's a question for Israel. What I can say is that, the big challenge for Israel is that China's a big partner, economic partner. And so that's really the means by which Beijing has influenced the region, is through their economic leverage. And one of the interesting things here is, as you were saying earlier, Iran's economy is weak due to sanctions, and China hasn't really been able to invest in Iran the way that they wanted to. So Iran's economic relationship, like the trade relationship, the investment relationship with China, pales in comparison to the Gulf countries and in Israel's relationship with China. So that's kind of Beijing's diplomatic strength here, and why they've kind of been able to play this balancing role. They have kind of this political partnership with Tehran, but they have deep economic ties with the rest of the region. And so even when the Gulf or Israel has been frustrated by China's support for Tehran, they also have to realize so much of the economic stakes that are at play with them with respect to China. So that's the play here, and that's what Israel would have to deal with, is if they were to really push back against China.
Oh, I'm not suggesting them ever attacking China.
Sure.
I'm saying, do you think it would drive them to, let's say, the J-10s arrive, here's the intelligence, they're all right here. Do you think that would be the Israelis would see that as so dangerous that it might force a second round of action?
It certainly could. I mean, again, I'm not an Israel expert, so I can't. But I will say there was reporting. So as I was saying earlier, when China was providing some of the ammonium perchlorate and sodium perchlorate to Iran to support their missile production, there was some reporting, I think, in the Israeli media this is speculative, but there was reporting that the timing of that may have also helped factored into Israel's decision on moving against Iran now. The idea that they wanted to move on, in June, they wanted to do those strikes before Iran was able to redevelop its missile capabilities with Chinese support. So That's purely speculative, but there's some thinking that that could have impacted, Israel's thinking.
Now the algorithm of TikTok, of course, is a black box, so I'm sure you can't give definitive answers. But do you recall that a Houthi pirate went viral on TikTok? He was called Houthi Timothy Chalamet. Do you remember this?
I am not aware of this.
Okay. Well, it was interesting. It was like Hassan Piker, they were sort of glorifying this Houthi pirate who was, very anti-Israel. Now, I mean, that could happen naturally, but is there a possibility that China is doing stuff with TikTok to, push sort of more of an anti-Israel, pro-Iranian perspective, or is that just purely speculation?
I don't know. It's not an issue I've looked into. I mean, but that is one of the concerns here in the United States about TikTok and its ownership by China, is that there has been reports that China has been able to, or that the TikTok and ByteDance have been able to kind of influence the algorithm in ways that elevate pro-Chinese stances, or maybe reduce good thing, like they can kind of warp the algorithm in ways that advantage China. So that's one of the concerns, but I can't speak to this specific incident.
Let's end on China itself. Now, one of the amazing things is how little we know about China, Americans know about China. Their internet is separated, obviously, from ours. It's sort of the whole country is sort of a black box to most Americans. We don't really have a good sense of that society. Do you go onto the Chinese internet, I assume?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I try to read, and doing our analysis, I try as much as I can to read what the Chinese are saying about these issues.
So I want to play for you some Chinese influencers, because it's not discussed much, but I've been shocked by some of and I assume that in China, to some degree, there's a green light, red light with these big influencers. If you start saying she is the Pooh Bear and we should kill him or something, like, you're getting the red light. You're not going to hear a lot of that from these guys. But here's some of the things that they've been saying, which sort of shocked me. These are Chinese influencers. For the audience, I'll try to read the subtitles. Okay.
但是这个犹太人会在你的背后毫不犹豫地杀死。
But I'm quoting the influencers. But this Jew will not hesitate to kill you from behind, seize half your loaf of bread.
并且夺下你的半块面包，与你沾满血液的
Press your blood-stained fingerprint onto an IOU.
手指按下欠条，最后他再拿着这个借条找你的亲人索要，这就是最真
This is the true nature of a Jew.
实的犹太人，这也是犹太人1000年以
And this
来
is the real reason why the Jews were
一
expelled.
直流浪，一且忘
And
恩
here's another one.
屠杀，我们应该对他们抱有同
So basically, she says some people say we should sympathize with the Jews.
情心，同时犹太人头脑灵活，善于经商，更是可以为我所用。但是老祖
But as the old saying goes, those who deserve pity must also have some blame.
宗说：“可怜之人必有可恨之处。”犹太民族遭受的罪
The suffering the Jewish people have experienced is connected to their
孽
sins.
跟他们的所作所为也有关系。一个自认高我们一等的民族，视我们为
When
蝼
people,
蚁。
okay, so and then another one, another Chinese journalist influencer.
人就是天生就坏，
Jews
他们的目
Jews are inherently evil, and their goal is to turn China into the next America.
的就是把中国变成下一个美国。犹太人啊，其实把所有的人
Jews actually treat all people as
而且有些人
livestock.
傻到甘做牛羊，真的是太可悲了。
Right. I could go on. It's been shocking how anti-Semitic a lot of these influencers are. Is it too much to infer that Xi has given a green light to this really extreme anti-Semitism, or is that reading too much into this?
Well, you're not wrong to point out there's been a lot of very unfortunate anti-Semitism in the Chinese media, I think, and online. I don't read that as, certainly Xi Jinping himself has not given any. I think those decisions are made way below his level on censorship and things like that on those issues from within the CCP. But I think I do think it's unfortunate that those things are really, making rounds on the Chinese media. But I don't know. I wouldn't, say that that's necessarily an intentional decision to. The Chinese media operates. It's really what's typically more censored is things that are specifically related to the CCP. So I think this is one of those things where the CCP is going to say this doesn't directly, impact, the CCP and our security, so we can let it go. I think when it becomes a problem that that media is, is really conflicting with Chinese policy on Israel or something like that, then they might clamp down or try to rein that in. But for the most part, the Chinese media they're going to let that kind of stuff go until it really conflicts with the CCP's interest.
How anti-Semitic is the Chinese internet?
I'm not the expert on this. I do know that there's an expert. I think his name is Tuvia Gehring. Has been. I think he's affiliated with the Atlantic Council in DC. Does a lot of work on studying Chinese discourse on Israel, and I think that there is quite a lot of bit of this anti-Semitism that circulates. But how prevalent it is, I think it's hard to say. It's not my expertise, but I do think it's unfortunate to see that it does have some traction, at least.
In closing, what do you think I am missing, or is there angle you think we haven't discussed that's very important, or do you think I'm overrating the importance of China in this?
I think one of the things that I would just flag is that so far there's been this kind of view that so far China hasn't really done anything to support Iran in this conflict, besides verbal support for them. But I think we're only a few weeks out from this initial skirmish or this initial conflict, and I think there's a lot that China can do down the road. It took a while for China to support Russia in its war against Ukraine, and 3 years later, China's still supporting Russia. So I think that there's quite a lot that we could see China do for Iran, and so I think that we're still in the early days, and people shouldn't write off that relationship. So yeah, I think it's important to keep an eye on this.
And is intelligence good enough that Israel and the U.S. would know? Would have some indication, they actually are sending the jets in next month? Or could it be something where it becomes a surprise, do you think?
It's hard to say, but I think that intelligence here would have some good, decent warning that something like that was going to happen. I mean, on some of the quieter means of support, maybe harder to detect, but transferring weapons, those kinds of things are things that I think that intelligence agencies would have a good sense that before that happens. And I'm sure that they're monitoring the situation closely.
I know you're more of an analyst rather than a policy advocate, but in closing, it seems to me like, with just little statements almost, America could maybe help avert a conflict arising from this Chinese transfer of sort of weaponry and stuff, just by saying, hey, we might really start upping those sanctions on China buying oil if you send J-10s or and then we could avert some kind of bloodshed coming from this. Do you think America should be making those statements or taking actions to avert this possibility, or do you think they don't have those kind of tools in this situation?
I mean, I think the United States should be telling China that they shouldn't be arming Iran and trying to convince them that it's not in their interests. And the United States was doing some of that during the conflict. They were saying, I think Secretary Rubio specifically put out, this statement calling on China to put pressure on Iran not to close the Strait of Hormuz, because they knew that was also in Beijing's interest. Beijing doesn't want to see the Strait of Hormuz closed because that has big potential downsides for their energy and economic security. So I think that this administration likely will be watching this and will be telling Beijing not to support Iran. Whether Beijing listens to that, of course, is up to them. But I do think it's in our interest to be trying to signal that we don't want to see this happen.
tell me, what are you focused on, and maybe what are you looking for as key signals about this issue?
Yeah, for me right now, again, I'm really viewing this, and we're doing a lot of research on understanding this to the extent to which there is this axis of upheaval of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. I'm looking to see, um, because we saw the Ukraine war accelerate relationships among those four countries, I'm looking to see whether this conflict will do the same, and how it'll be different. What Beijing's willing to risk to support Iran, what they're not willing to do, how Russia supports and how North Korea potentially supports Iran. There's a lot that those countries could potentially do, and they can network their capabilities together. I mean, China can provide precursor dual use goods to ship to other countries to then supply Iran or Russia with missiles and things like that. So I'm surely really trying to figure out what that relationship looks like among those countries, and how that's going to evolve in the coming years, because those four countries and their actions are really at the core of the U.S. national security and geopolitical interests. So that's really what I'm watching.
One last thing. You remember how Tom Friedman, was very close with Biden? People would read his column as sort of a signal of maybe what Biden was thinking on the Middle East. Is there like a Chinese columnist, a few names that sort of play that role that you look to as a signal of maybe what she is thinking?
There's actually, there's a couple of Chinese scholars that I really read on a couple of things. But I think actually the most important thing to really do with the Chinese system is, those scholars don't always reflect what Beijing's actually thinking. They may be, really excellent scholars, but what I really pay attention to is Chinese state media, specifically outlets like People's Daily, which is the main party newspaper. And there are a couple of authoritative kind of code names within those that write regular columns on these issues. Those are really important, and you often have to read them in Chinese, so that's the challenge. But those are really important signals.
Do you say code names?
Well, they have certain names that write columns, but they're essentially names of people that don't actually exist. They're typically names that are aligned with, if someone's writing on an economic issue, it'll often come under one name. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but yeah, I think People's Daily in general is kind of a key source for just understanding the most authoritative things. But it requires Chinese language skills typically, and it also typically requires some understanding of like how the Chinese political system works and the verbiage they use to kind of untangle that.
But there's no name of like a guy who writes or makes statements who actually knows Xi or.
So one of the things that you'll see is about every month, the Chinese, the Communist Party's Politburo, which is their 25-man group of their top leaders, meets typically monthly, and they do a study session on different issues. And they'll often have experts come in to brief them on whatever the issue of that month is. So that's often a good view of like who among these experts, maybe they're professors or kind of state-run think tank scholars that come and brief them. So those kinds of people are often ones that kind of clearly have the ear of the Communist Party leadership.
Thank you so much, Brian, for your expertise. We need more voices like you that actually care about facts and not clickbait. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.